Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Schmidt. I'm the editor for Premodern World History here at UC Press. And I'm here today with Giancarlo Casale, who is professor of early modern Mediterranean history at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, as well as a permanent member of the history faculty at the University of Minnesota. He's also an award-winning author and translator, and internationally recognized expert on Ottoman history. Thanks so much for joining us, Giancarlo.
Thank you, Eric.
So today we're going to just talk briefly about Giancarlo's translation of Prisoner of the Infidels, the memoir of an Ottoman Muslim in 17th century Europe. This is the first English translation of this pioneering work of Ottoman Turkish literature, and it's a really exciting new release in California's growing World Literature and Translation program. So maybe to get started, Giancarlo, could you tell us a little bit about the book and what motivated you to do a translation of this work in particular?
Sure. The most basic reason is I just really like the book. I think Osman is a fascinating character, and I love the writing, and I really just wanted to make it accessible to a wider audience. But at the same time, it's a work of firsts. I mean, it's the very first book-length autobiography that was ever written in the Ottoman Turkish language. And it's also the first literary memoir about life in early modern Europe that was ever written from the perspective of a Muslim slave. So it's really, there isn't anything else like it. It's an extremely unique and compelling story, and it's interesting from a historical perspective, but it's also, it's just sort of a fascinating literary milestone.
Yeah, one of the main goals of our World Literature and Translation program is really to expand our sense of what counts as a classic, and for literature to really be inclusive of traditions from around the world instead of just the more kind of Western or European focused lists that are more traditionally associated with something like Penguin Classics. Can you tell us a little bit about why it's so critical to have an English translation of this memoir in Ottoman Turkish literature? And how does this work really expand our understanding of world history and literature?
Yeah, so, we're trained to think in terms of binaries, right? World literature over here, European literature over here. Also, in terms of the Ottomans and Europe, there's always this expectation that there is a very clear civilizational divide that's, dividing Ottomans on one side and Europeans on the other side. In this case, though, it's really fascinating and important to remember that Osman, although he is writing in Ottoman Turkish and he is an Ottoman author, he also is a European. He was born and raised in a city that's now in Romania. And he spent his entire life in Europe, partly in the Ottoman Balkans, partly in Austria and Croatia and Italy and Germany and all the places that he talks about in his memoir. And so when you're reading it, it isn't quite clear where the Ottoman Empire ends and where Europe begins. And in fact, I would argue that that's really sort of the moral of the story of Osman's life. By the time you get to the end of his book, he isn't really very clear about how to draw that line. In fact, this is very explicit. I don't want to ruin the ending for anybody, but in the scene where he actually crosses the border and escapes successfully from Habsburg territory into Ottoman territory, it's just in your face, this lack of being able to draw a very clear line between being an Ottoman and being a European. And so he's also sort of raising this question of, he's writing this book at the end of his life in Istanbul. And by that time, his hometown is no longer a part of the Ottoman Empire. It's now become a part of the Habsburg Empire. And so as an Ottoman Muslim in the Ottoman capital, writing about his life, he's in exile. You can't understand the point of what Ottoman is doing in his book if you think of Ottoman literature as somehow separate from European literature. Complicating the distinction between those two things and trying to understand them in relationship to one another is sort of the foundation of why he's writing.
Yeah. One thing about Prisoner of the Infidels is it's actually a real page turner when you sit down to read it. When you say to someone, well, it's a 17th century biography, someone think, oh, that sounds kind of abstruse or boring. But this is really a fun book full of adventure, humor, and there's a lot of really deep emotion. In fact, when we kind of pitch it out to bookstores and to other people, we often kind of talk about it as Victor Hugo meets Papillon. Can you tell us a little bit about a favorite scene or moment in the story? Something that can also kind of help us understand what's unique about this work and Osman's kind of very particular perspective.
Yeah, so there are so many, but I think my personal favorite scene, it's very close to the beginning of the book. So to set the stage, Osman has been he's been captured by Hungarian bandits. They have despoiled him of everything. They have stripped him naked. They've tied him, and they're about to execute him. He's sure that he's facing death. He says a prayer. It's a very moving prayer, preparing himself for the end. And then he escapes by the skin of his teeth. And there's a kind of a heart-pounding escape scene. And then finally, he does escape, and he finds himself alone in the wilderness, and the mosquitoes come. It's night falls, and the mosquitoes start to bite him, and he just loses it. And he says, you know, "Oh God, why did you spare me from the blade of the infidel if in the end your plan for me was that I should die by the torment of 1,000 mosquito bites?" And it's very funny because, you know, compared to being beheaded, being bit by mosquitoes is sort of the least of his problems. But it's also, in terms of narrative strategy, it's so interesting because it's a melodramatic moment that sort of breaks the tension, but it also opens a window into his inner self. And you see how fragile he is after having survived this traumatic experience. And then, you know, finally the mosquitoes, it's just one straw breaks the camel's back, and he just has a kind of a mental breakdown. And I think it's a good example of what I appreciate so much about Osman's writing, is how he's able to combine these different kinds of storytelling in a way that is exciting, but also gives you this window into his own very intimate experiences. And if you think about, you know, this is a person who had rudimentary education, and at least in a formal sense, who spent most of his formative years as a slave. And he's writing the first autobiography ever in his language. To be able to do something that sophisticated, it's really amazing to me.
You actually published a short essay that we posted on our blog, but you talk about all of the wide variety and the depth of character of the many women that are highlighted in the story that come in and out of Osman's life and his adventures. Can you tell us a little bit about one of your favorite scenes there?
Well, there are so many of these fascinating characters, and in various ways, they all sort of get back to this theme of transgression and crossing borders and the fragility of self. You know, there is actually a woman who is a cross-dresser because it's the only way that she can join the Austrian army, which is her dream. There's a woman who's the daughter of a pious Muslim from Belgrade who becomes a prostitute. There is a woman who is like Osman. She's a kind of an adventurer, survivor that has managed to escape and cross Europe incognito, and then eventually joins Osman in the last dash across the border. Maybe the most complicated relationship that he has is actually with his owner, the woman who he belongs to for 7 years when he's living in Vienna. She's sort of a benevolent figure, but you know, her benevolence has an edge because she has enslaved Osman. And when he's talking about his relationship with her, he's always wrestling with, you know, is he a slave to her, or is he just loyal to her? Is she his protector, or is she his tormentor? And even in the end, when he escapes, this is one of the things that makes his escape so complicated, is he thinks that he might not make it, and he has a dream, and he's being hounded by dogs, and he's trying to scamper across the border, and then right at the top of the mountain that divides the Ottoman territory from Habsburg territory, he sees her, and he's afraid at first, and then she turns to him and she says, "Don't worry, I'm here. Everything is going to be fine. I'm here to protect you." And so in this moment when he actually has escaped from her, she intervenes in his dream, and he understands that she's still there protecting him. It's another very interesting sort of moment in which he's opening up the window to his inner self and really letting you share these extremely complex emotions of his experience of being enslaved.
Yeah, it also goes to show how much this is not just a book about him, but about all the people that come in and out of his life and the way he weaves them together into this story. So you really have this kind of broadcast of characters that you see in a depth that you don't usually associate with memoir, where you usually think of it more as kind of plumbing your own depths, whereas he seems to look at other people and think about them in a very clear-sighted way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one of the most fun things about the book for me is just kind of getting to be enveloped in a world that you can only know usually from remote sources or from a telling of someone who's read a book about a book by someone who read a book about a book by someone who read a book. This kind of immediate access to a world. It almost feels like watching a movie. Or, you know, for those of us who kind of come into world literature from our childhood, I loved adventure books and fantasy books, and it almost has that kind of feel. It has that kind of broad intellectual journey, but also the adventure along the way that's so kind of compelling and exciting. And to know this is a real person living and thinking through their life and dealing with the horrible and catastrophic events that they've had to live through makes it just that much more exciting to read.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you get the feeling that he has told the story many times, sort of sitting around the table, reliving his experiences, and he's sort of rehearsed these things, because a lot of his writing really has the feeling that you're sort of in the room with him and he's telling you things as he's remembering them, and it comes through very clearly in the way that he tells his story.
So tell us a little about some of the challenges and considerations that you had to make or face while you were translating the work, since it's never been translated before, and this is your area of specialty, so it's really hard to, or not hard, but you really need to both step back and be really deep into the material.
Well, there are practical considerations. I mean, his original manuscript is just an uninterrupted text. So there are no chapter headings, there are no paragraph breaks, there aren't even really any sentences, in the sense that Ottoman Turkish didn't have punctuation in the way that we understand it. So compared to a translation from a modern European language, there's a lot more interpretive work that has to go into it. But that said, I think the thing that I struggled with the most was trying to reproduce in English the experience of reading it in Turkish. I mean by that is most Ottoman literature is very Baroque. You know, there's heavy use of unfamiliar vocabulary and lots of Persian and Arabic grammar, complicated literary references and allegory. And the idea is really that a meaning is supposed to emerge slowly and to have many levels and to only be accessible to the privileged few. And Osman is not like that at all. He just is extremely accessible, and he writes, he loves vernacular language, he loves direct speech. And when you're reading in Turkish, it's actually very disorienting, because when you read something that's from the 18th century, it's not supposed to sound like that. So how to sort of reproduce that in English was something I struggled with. I wanted it to be an extremely faithful translation, but if it was too literal, it would have seemed sort of stiff and distant in a way that it doesn't seem at all in Turkish. So there was no solution that I ever found to that problem. It was just sort of something I was continually wrestling with.
My completely unbiased take is that you succeeded admirably. The final translation.
Thank you.
Beautiful and fun. I mean, you know, fun is maybe not the best word to describe some of the things that go on in the book, but it's a deep and wonderful read, and there's just so much to enjoy. And I also find it's one of those books you kind of want to go back to over and over again, because there's so much happening underneath the kind of straightforward storyline in many ways, that the richness kind of just reemerges from reading particular passages or going back through his entire life. So maybe just tell us a little bit about one thing you'd love for us, or for any reader, to really take away from the book.
I mean, I think for me that it's really connected to that. I wanted to translate it because it was exactly the kind of thing that every time I read it, I noticed something different. And you know, when you translate a text, you have to read it over and over and over, and you have to really pore over every word. And I never got tired of doing that. So I guess I just hope that people can read it and really appreciate it and enjoy it, to see it not as just a historical source that a scholar might want to be able to mine for information, but really as a really groundbreaking work of literature. And I hope people can enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed translating it.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today, Giancarlo. I'm really excited about the book, and I hope as many people enjoy it as we have.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you.
Thanks, Giancarlo.